They brought him out at dawn. No crowd, no gallows, no last words. By sunset, there was no body, no grave, no ashes, nothing. Just silence, sand, fear. Whatever happened that day wasn't just punishment, it was a warning. And for centuries, the details of this execution were whispered about, not spoken aloud, because it wasn't meant to end a life. It was meant to erase it. At the edge of recorded history, there are moments that don't quite fit. A name vanishes from royal ledgers, a trial leaves no verdict. A sentence is carried out, but there's no burial, no tombstone, and not a single bone to mark its finality. These are not errors in the record. They are the design. In 1572, under the shadow of the Spanish Inquisition, a man named Juan de Moriana, Jesuit scholar and occasional critic of royal absolutism, disappeared from public view after being arrested by church authorities. The details of his detention were documented. His transfer to a remote monastery was noted. After that, nothing. No death certificate, no funeral, no record of pardon or release. Just absence. Centuries later, some believe he died quietly of illness. Others suspect a silencing beyond death. The kind meant not just to remove a person, but to erase the problem they represented. Such disappearances were not uncommon in systems that prioritized ideological control over judicial transparency. During the reign of Ivan the Terrible in Russia, the Oprishniks' personal enforcers would abduct accused dissenters at night. Those taken were rarely seen again. Their property was seized, their families exiled, and their names scrubbed from public records. The Tsar did not need trials to justify removal. He needed obedience, and fear filled the silence left behind. Centuries later, totalitarian regimes would refine this tactic. In Argentina's Dirty War from 1976 to 1983, thousands of suspected political opponents were abducted, detained without trial, and disappeared. Many were drugged, loaded onto planes, and dropped into the Atlantic. The junta denied everything. Without bodies, families were left with no closure, no evidence, and no legal recourse. It became one of the most systematic campaigns of erasure in modern history, but the method goes further back. Medieval Europe offers its own, quieter examples. Heretics condemned by the Church were sometimes executed in secret, their bodies incinerated with quicklime to prevent martyrdom, their names condemned, their teachings outlawed, their memory forbidden. Inquisitors knew that a corpse could become a relic. Ashes, on the other hand, were easier to forget. This script will follow the thread of one such case, an execution buried, not in dirt, but in silence. No eyewitness accounts, no monument, only fragmented clues scattered across censored letters, altered court logs, and whispered oral histories. Who was this person, and why did their execution leave nothing behind? What does it mean when a society decides not just to punish, but to unexist someone? The answers lie in the forgotten corners of power, control, and fear in certain regimes. Death was not enough. For some crimes, punishment went further, stripping not just the life of the accused, but their presence in memory, their name in the records, and their place in history. These were crimes against power. Not theft, not murder, but acts considered so dangerous to the political or spiritual order that the guilty were not simply executed. They were erased. In medieval Europe, heresy was one such offense. To question church doctrine was to question divine authority. Figures like Fra Dolcino, who led a radical Christian sect in northern Italy during the early 1300s, were seen not only as religious threats, but as challenges to the Church's political control. When Dulcino was captured in 1307, he was tortured and executed, but the effort didn't stop there. His followers were hunted down, their writings destroyed, and the group's memory buried under centuries of church silence. In some cases, even depictions of these individuals were banned. No likenesses, no names, no graves. Treason, especially against monarchs claiming divine right, was treated with similar severity. In Tudor England, the state made an art of punishment, and the erasure of traitors was a calculated move. After the failed gunpowder plot of 1605, Guy Fawkes was executed publicly, but his co-conspirators met a more obscured fate. Some were tortured into confession, executed in secret, and buried in unmarked graves. Families of the condemned were often prohibited from mourning publicly. In the eyes of the crown, their deaths weren't enough. Their lineage had to be cut off, their names blacklisted, their memory wiped. The Catholic Church formalized this concept through damnatio memoriae, a process by which someone's legacy was systematically destroyed. Though the term itself dates to ancient Rome, the practice extended into the late medieval and early modern period, when Giordano Bruno was executed in 1600 for blasphemy and heresy. His death was intended to send a message. He was burned alive in Rome, and no official portrait or writings of his survived within Catholic domains. The Vatican kept his trial records sealed for centuries. Erasure became part of the punishment. In the Byzantine Empire, similar punishments were applied to disgraced emperors. After the fall of Emperor Phocas in 610 AD, official histories removed favorable references to his reign. His statues were torn down, inscriptions chiseled off. In certain cases, such as with the usurper Leontios, coins were melted and reminted to erase his image. The intent was not just to delegitimize a ruler, was to erase the claim that he had ever ruled at all. Modern totalitarian regimes revived these tactics with new efficiency. Stalin's Soviet Union is a textbook example. Political opponents, including former allies like Nikolai Yezhov, were purged, executed, and later removed from photographs, textbooks, and state records. Yezhovant's head of the NKVD was famously edited out of photos after his fall. In official archives, he ceased to exist. Throughout history, certain crimes triggered a unique response. Not just punishment, erasure, a silent, thorough, bureaucratic effort to ensure the accused would not become a martyr, a symbol, or a memory. The threat they posed wasn't just in what they did, it was in what they represented. And for that they had to disappear, completely docked in the Roman Empire. Execution could take more than one form. A sword could silence a man. A cross could end his breath. But the most feared punishment reserved not for common criminals, but for disgraced emperors, traitors, and enemies of the state was damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory, the condemnation of memory. The phrase translates directly as the condemnation of memory, but its implications went far beyond words. When the Roman Senate issued such a decree, it was not content with death alone. It aimed to erase the individual entirely from statues, paintings, coins, inscriptions, and public records. The condemned would not become a martyr, a symbol, or even a cautionary tale. They would become a void and unperson. One of the earliest and most documented cases was that of Publius Septimius Geta, the younger son of Emperor Septimius Severus. After Severus died in 211 AD, his sons Geta and Caracalla became joint emperors. Within a year, the experiment failed. In a calculated move, Caracalla murdered his brother in their mother's arms and immediately ordered a damnatio memoriae. Geta's statues were destroyed. His face was chiseled out of bas-reliefs. Coins bearing his likeness were melted down. His name was erased from official decrees, and citizens were forbidden from speaking of him. Over 20,000 of his supporters were killed in the purge that followed. The same treatment would later be inflicted on Emperor Elagabalus, whose reign between 218 and 222 AD was marked by scandal, religious controversy, and instability. After his assassination, the Senate declared damnatio memoriae. His images were removed from temples, his official portraits defaced, and inscriptions bearing his name were altered or destroyed. Elagabalus, though once the ruler of the known world, was systematically removed from public consciousness. This was more than political vengeance. It was psychological warfare. In Roman society, legacy was sacred. Family lines were honored through ancestral masks, public dedications, and lineage rituals. To erase someone's memory was to deny them a future in the afterlife and a place. In the story of Rome, even their family could suffer. Stripped of honors and legal standing, the practice endured for centuries because it worked. Not every condemned figure was fully erased. History tends to leave traces, but the fear of being forgotten entirely was potent. Even emperors, with armies and marble palaces behind them, were not immune. It was a reminder that Rome's power did not stop at the grave. It reached into memory, into language, into time itself. Later regimes would adapt this model. The Spanish Inquisition, the Soviet Union, modern authoritarian states all followed a similar logic. When execution is no longer enough, the next step is erasure. What damnatio memoriae reveals is that death can be public, but oblivion that is orchestrated. And in some eras of history, being remembered was a privilege. Being forgotten was the final punishment. In the architecture of fear, some worked in plain sight: kings, judges, soldiers. Others operated in the dark, crafting punishments that left no graves, no records, and no voices left to speak. These were the toolmakers of silence, not executioners in the public square, but men trained to erase. In Spain, during the height of the Inquisition, these figures wore robes, not armor, under the authority of the Catholic Church. Inquisitors like Tomás de Torquemada wielded the mandate to purge heresy not just from belief, but from existence. Heretics were interrogated in closed chambers, condemned without legal representation, and in many cases, executed without witnesses. Bodies burned in secret, ashes scattered without ceremony. Inquisitorial scribes documented only what served. The institution, testimonies were redacted, identities withheld. Even death became anonymous when the name threatened the church's image. By the late 15th century, entire families could vanish from the Spanish record under suspicion of crypto-Judaism or secret Islamic practice. Confessions obtained under torture were sealed. Accused individuals might disappear into underground cells, their property seized, their lineage erased from local registers. In some towns, inquisitors collaborated with royal officials to eliminate enemies under religious pretext, ensuring both spiritual and political silence. In Tudor England, similar strategies were deployed, though under a different banner. Agents of the Crown operated under the Privy Council, the Star Chamber, and, under Elizabeth I, the shadowy network of Francis Walsingham's spy apparatus. Walsingham, England's principal secretary, oversaw a vast intelligence operation against Catholic dissidents, foreign agents, and political subversives. His men intercepted letters, planted informants, and in some cases, orchestrated disappearances. John Gerard, a Jesuit priest, was arrested and tortured in the Tower of London in the 1590s. Others like him were less fortunate. Edmund Campion, accused of conspiracy, was executed and displayed, but some of his companions simply vanished. Their names appear in captured correspondences but are absent from execution rolls. No burial, no trial, no further mention. In the Ottoman Empire, the silence was often more surgical. The palace of Topkapi had its own methods. When power struggles erupted within the imperial harem or court, eunuchs or janissary guards were tasked with removing political threats discreetly. In the 17th century, Sultan Ibrahim I reportedly ordered the execution of 280 concubines by drowning, suspecting disloyalty. There was no announcement, no trial. The Bosphorus carried no trace. Executioners in Istanbul were known as chelit, and while their role was official, the method was not always public. Political rivals, brothers of the Sultan, or defiant governors, were often strangled with silk cords to avoid spilling royal blood. Once dead, the body might be buried in secret unmarked and undocumented. These were not executions to warn the people. These were removals to preserve a narrative. In every empire, someone stood between power and truth, not to tell it, but to bury it. Torturers who broke confessions no one would read. Clerks who altered names. Guards who delivered the condemned to places from which no sound returned. They didn't just enforce silence, they manufactured it. Some executions were not just meant to kill, they were meant to remove. Remove the body, the trace, the evidence, leaving behind only a chilling void. In states where control depended on fear, and fear on uncertainty, the absence of a corpse was sometimes more effective than its display. Methods evolved not only for efficiency, but for erasure. Fire was among the oldest tools used for this purpose. In medieval Europe, burning at the stake served two functions. Publicly, it was spectacle punishment for heresy, witchcraft, or treason. But under certain conditions, fire became a method of obliteration. When the Catholic Church wanted to destroy not just the heretic, but the possibility of relics or posthumous reverence, the fire was fed long and hot enough to ensure no remains survived. Inquisitorial records from Spain and southern France describe executions where ashes were deliberately scattered in rivers, mixed with lime, or thrown into wind to prevent collection. Jan Hus, the Czech reformer burned at the stake in 1415 at the Council of Constance, had his remains cast into the Rhine, to ensure followers couldn't preserve even a fragment. Lime accelerated that process. Known since antiquity for its corrosive properties, quick lime calcium oxide was used in several contexts to dispose of bodies discreetly. When combined with water, it produces intense heat, capable of breaking down soft tissue over time. While not as fast as modern forensic fiction might suggest, when buried in lime pits or submerged in lime-slaked environments, corpses deteriorated faster and less visibly. During the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, mass graves were sometimes filled with quicklime to both speed decomposition and erase evidence. Francoist forces used this technique in extrajudicial killings, making exhumation and identification more difficult decades later. Thousands of families still seek closure knowing where their relatives were killed, but unable to find anything. Left to bury. In the Ottoman Empire, water played a similar role. The Bosphorus Straits became a dumping ground for those the palace wanted gone without a trace. Records from the 17th century describe concubines, political prisoners, and even janissary leaders executed quietly at night and cast into the current. Without a body, there could be no grave. Without a grave, no mourning. The water removed the body and washed the blame downstream, in Venice. The Council of Ten, powerful political body, employed secret trials and executions. Some victims were taken through back canals at night, weighted, and dropped into the lagoon. The symbolism was clear. Resistance would vanish without record, without explanation. Even in Nazi Germany, the SS occasionally used crematoria not just for mass extermination, but to obliterate high-profile individuals. In occupied territories, assassinated resistance leaders were sometimes burned entirely and dumped into rivers, with names scrubbed from documents. The technique, though mechanized, mirrored older traditions: kill, destroy, forget. Each of these methods, fire, lime, water, was chosen not only for practical disposal, but for the message it sent. The state would not grant you a martyr's death. It would erase you so thoroughly that you never existed. And in some corners of history, that silence still lingers. In the early spring of 1568, under the looming shadow of the Habsburg crackdown in the Low Countries, a man named Egmont Gall disappeared from the city of Ghent. Officially, there was no trial, no charges, no body, only a silence that followed his name like fog through the records of Flanders. What happened to him remains one of the most quietly unsettling episodes in the early phases of the Dutch Revolta conflict that would reshape Europe. For 80 years, Gall was a minor official, a city secretary with known sympathies toward the growing Calvinist movement. He had connections to reformist merchants and was rumored to have supplied sensitive information to anti-Spanish factions operating in Antwerp and Leiden. In a time when loyalty to Philip II of Spain was enforced by the sword and the scaffold, dissent was not punished with argument, it was removed in 1567. The Duke of Alba arrived in the Netherlands with the explicit task of crushing rebellion. He brought with him a tribunal known to the population as the Council of Blood Court that operated without defense, often without evidence, and certainly without mercy. By early 1568, hundreds had been executed. Others vanished without legal process. Gall's name does not appear in the official records of the council, but a letter from a Bruges merchant, dated April 3, 1568, mentions him directly. The Secretary of Ghent is taken, no word yet of his condition. The plaza was quiet, no ropes, no fire. That same month, several documents tied to Calvinist pamphleteers in the region were seized. Among them was a coded note believed to be from Gall, referencing a plan to leak Spanish troop movements to rebel commanders. Whether he was betrayed or intercepted remains unknown. What is clear is that he was removed from his home in the middle of the night by Spanish soldiers under the command of Captain Francisco de Valdez, whose personal correspondence preserved in archives in Simancas makes indirect reference to a clerk whose voice shall be no further danger. There is no death certificate, no grave. The city archives in Ghent list his position as vacant by May, with no cause stated. His family was placed under watch, his estate frozen, then seized. In a rare surviving page from the civic ledger, the entry beside his name is scraped out with a blade, a crude but deliberate attempt to sever his existence from the official. Later oral accounts speak of a walled well in the courtyard of the Gravenstein castle. Local workers believed the site had been used more than once during Alba's terror. Whether Gall's body lies there has never been confirmed. Excavations have been limited, blocked at times by property disputes and heritage concerns. To this day, historians debate whether Egmont Gall was formally executed or simply eliminated. No witnesses ever came forward. No trial transcripts exist. Yet multiple indirect references suggest that his disappearance was sanctioned, ordered, and intended to be untraceable. In the machinery of empire, it was more efficient to delete than to justify. His case was not unique, but it is one of the few with just enough surviving fragments to illustrate how power can silence without spectacle. A body never found, a memory intentionally erased, and a warning left behind in its place. Public executions were designed to display power bodies swinging from scaffolds, heads on pikes, flames consuming flesh before a crowd. These were warnings. But in some regimes, spectacle gave way to silence, and silence, weaponized, proved even more effective. When someone disappears without trial, without a body, without a reason, what remains is fear that cannot be measured. The public can rationalize a hanging, even if they disagree with it. But a vanishing leaves only questions. Who's next? What did they say? Who reported them? Monarchs and rulers who sought to preserve absolute control understood this dynamic well. In the Russian Empire under Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible, his private militia, the obliteration, became infamous not for public executions, but for the quiet ones. Dressed in black, riding black horses, they conducted arrests at night. Entire families vanished. Sometimes neighbors awoke to see their homes emptied. No explanation was ever offered. The Tsar didn't need to show the bodies. The absence was enough. In the early years of Nazi Germany, long before the camps became synonymous with industrialized death, the Gestapo used targeted disappearances to dismantle political resistance. Suspected communists, union leaders, and outspoken clergy were arrested and taken to so-called protective custody in secret locations. There were no court proceedings, no newspaper headlines, only a quiet removal from society. Many were never heard from again. Their silence chilled dissent more effectively than a trial ever could. In Franco's Spain, particularly during the White Terror of the 1930s and 40s, entire communities were subjected to this strategy. Local officials, teachers, unionists, at night executed without record, and buried in unmarked graves or thrown into ravines. The official silence around their fate created a culture of generational silence. In many households, children were warned never to ask about relatives who went away. The logic was consistent across empires. A visible punishment risked martyrdom. A disappearance, by contrast, discouraged solidarity. It isolated the target. It eroded trust. In a society where anyone could be accused and no one was safe, people became their own jailers. This tactic extended beyond death. In China's Cultural Revolution, dissidents were not always killed, but struggled against, publicly denounced, then erased from academic positions, party roles, and eventually from collective memory. The fear was not only of violence, but of invisibility, to be removed from history, from books, from family records. This was a punishment that lingered far beyond death. Total control doesn't always need noise. Often, it thrives in the quiet. When punishment becomes invisible, it also becomes inescapable. The fear of being next, without knowing why, kept millions in line more effectively than any execution platform. And in regimes obsessed with obedience, fear itself became the most reliable instrument of power. In historical records, Silence often signals intention. The disappearance of names, the absence of trials, the blank spaces in ledgers, these aren't accidents of time. They're decisions made by people in power. Censorship wasn't always loud. Often it looked like a missing page, a burned journal, or a royal decree never copied into the archive. Monarchs, emperors, and inquisitors understood that control over memory was as important as control over territory. In 17th century France, under Cardinal Richelieu, state archives were purged of materials deemed politically dangerous. Agents were tasked with removing letters, pamphlets, or records that contradicted the narrative of royal legitimacy. Chroniclers close to the court were paid not only to write history, but to write certain people out of it. In the Spanish Netherlands, during the suppression of Protestant dissent, inquisitorial scribes routinely redacted names, altered dates, or omitted entire interrogations from final records. Cases involving heretical noble families were often handled off the books to avoid stirring sympathy or scandal. Documents that once existed, confessions, arrest warrants, correspondences, were deliberately excluded from preservation. Over time, the state's official version of events became the only version allowed to survive. Bribery played a quiet but central role in this machinery of forgetting. In Ottoman court circles, it was not uncommon for family members of executed officials to negotiate directly with imperial scribes. In exchange for silence, payments were made to prevent certain names from appearing in execution rolls or tax records. A name not written was a fate unconfirmed. In the historical sense, it was a form of mercy, but also complicity in erasure. Chronicles, especially those written by court-appointed historians, were frequently edited decades after initial publication. During the reign of the Habsburg Emperor Charles V, chroniclers like Pedro Mexia were expected to glorify the dynasty while glossing over purges, failed rebellions, or internal political feuds. Later editors, under pressure from the crown, revised earlier drafts to align with current political needs. In doing so, entire individuals, events, and conflicts were sanded away. When written records failed or were forcibly wiped, oral history stepped in rural Spain. Stories of priests or local judges who vanished during the Inquisition were kept alive through whispered family tales. In Polish villages occupied by both Nazi and Soviet forces, the memory of people who disappeared, teachers, resistance fighters, clergy, persisted, not through archives, but in kitchen conversations, folk songs, and funerary rituals with no bodies to bury. Oral memory carried what official memory discarded. But over generations, even those stories fragment. Details fade, names blur. Without documentation, truth becomes vulnerable to revision. And so the erasure, begun by decree or fire, finishes slowly through time. Historical silence isn't always a gap. Sometimes it's a wall built deliberately to protect the powerful, to bury failure, to make fear permanent. And behind that silence are the clerks, the archivists, the censors who made forgetting look official. Not every disappearance left proof. In fact, many were never confirmed at all. No witness, no confession, no burial, just a name spoken in hushed tones, followed by a blank space in the records. And yet, the fear those absences produced was real. In some cases, more real than the events themselves. In authoritarian regimes, this uncertainty wasn't a flaw, it was a tactic. When a person disappears without explanation, no body, no charges, No trial, it creates a vacuum. Into that space floods rumor, speculation, and fear. People begin to police their own behavior, not because they know what the state punishes, but because they don't. During the Soviet Great Purge of the late 1930s, thousands were arrested by the NKVD in the dead of night. Some were executed, others sent to labor camps, but many simply vanished. Families received no information. Neighbors were warned not to ask. The ambiguity itself was paralyzing. In this fog, myth and reality began to blur. Stories spread about underground prisons beneath Moscow, secret trains to nowhere, and interrogation rooms that left no trace. Not all were true, but it didn't matter. The fear they generated was more effective than truth. The Khmer Rouge in Cambodia operated on similar logic. From 1975 to 1979, under Pol Pot's regime, individuals disappeared for infractions as minor as speaking a foreign language or wearing glasses. Some were executed in known places like Tulslang prison. Others were never seen again. Entire communities avoided certain topics, even with family members. People feared things they couldn't verify because in a system ruled by silence, suspicion filled the void. Modern black sites echo this tradition. Following the September 11th attacks, the CIA operated a network of undisclosed detention centers outside U.S. legal jurisdiction. Individuals captured in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and elsewhere were transferred to locations never officially acknowledged. They were held without charges, interrogated, sometimes tortured. Even their families were denied knowledge of their whereabouts. Legal records were classified. Names were redacted. In the media and human rights circles, speculation about locations from Poland to Thailand to Romania swirled for years. Some of those places were later confirmed, others remain rumors. But the message sent was unmistakable. The state had the capacity to remove a person entirely, and without oversight. This blend of fact and fear creates a psychological environment where people avoid dissent. Not because they know what the limits are, but because they don't. A confirmed execution invites outrage. A disappearance cloaked in rumor spreads quiet obedience. People begin to imagine worst-case scenarios and act accordingly. Whether every disappearance happened the way people believe is beside the point. Fear doesn't rely on proof. It relies on possibility. And regimes that understand this don't need to silence everyone. They just need a few to go missing, and the rest will fall silent on their own. Long after the physical instruments of power are gone, the gallows dismantled, the prisons emptied, the courts disbanded, the fear remains. Not of death itself, but of the kind of death that leaves no remains, no last words, no witness, no grave. The kind of death designed not just to end a life, but to erase it completely. In regions once controlled by the Spanish Inquisition, stories of vanishing priests and silenced heretics still circulate in local memory. In villages across Castile and Aragon, older generations recounted warnings about men taken by the Holy Office whose names were never written again. Parents didn't tell their children these stories for entertainment. They were warnings, reminder of what happens when someone speaks too loudly or too soon. In the Balkans, memories of Ottoman disappearances have survived through oral tradition rather than state record. Songs passed down through families reference unnamed officials taken to the fortress and never seen again. These stories aren't always verifiable, but their endurance speaks to the emotional impact of erasure. It's not just the absence of the person. The way the system made those around them forget, or pretend to, even in modern states, where official ideology has changed and former prisons have been converted into museums. The psychological impact of these disappearances continues to shape public trust. In Argentina, the children of the desaparecidos, the disappeared, have grown up in search of names, records, DNA. Their identity was interrupted by a state policy of silence. In response, memory itself has become resistance. Memorials like the Parque de la Memoria in Buenos Aires are filled not just with names of the dead, but with names once denied. What makes these executions different from others isn't just how they were carried out, it's how they were designed to live on in silence. A public execution ends on a scaffold. A secret disappearance never ends. It haunts records, creates gaps in genealogy, and turns family members into lifelong researchers. In this way, erasure becomes its own legacy, not of the victim, but of the system that demanded silence. And this is where the terror lies. Power that can kill is feared, but power that can erase, that can make someone unexist, is obeyed without challenge. It rewrites the past and controls the future. It forces people to self-censor, not out of principle, but out of survival. And the most frightening part is that, long after the regime falls, its silence can continue speaking. There is no monument for the execution that left no body. Only the unease in the stories that remain, pass between generations like contraband memory. Because when someone is removed so completely that even their absence is denied, what's left behind isn't just fear. It's a warning written in silence.